Columbus, New Mexico, the United States, 1916. You arrive back on the last train from El Paso, the infamous drunkard special, and stagger down the dark streets of Columbus. You hear a familiar rattle. You nervously scan the floor for a rattlesnake. Distracted by your search, you don't hear the pounding of hooves until it's too late. Masked horsemen race into the town shouting, "Viva Villa!" and "Viva Mexico!" Frantically you hide behind some barrels. Someone emerges from a house and begins shouting at the horseman. A rifle barks, and the top of his head is blown off. Doors are kicked in and residents dragged out to be killed. The only hotel in the town is a hellhole of gunfire and screams. While soon flames begin to consume it. Then, one of the bandits spots you. Raising his rifle, he walks closer with a cruel smile on his face. Just as you are saying your prayers, he steps on a rattlesnake. It bites deeply into his left leg as he screams in pain and terror. While he is distracted, you run into the desert to escape the inferno. Soon your little town will be famous across America. This outrage, the cause of a new American invasion of Mexico. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
damals uns ausgebeten, wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome back. In the last episode, we saw how Mexico plunged into revolution, while an inexperienced President Wilson ordered the occupation of Veracruz. Today, we fast forward to 1916. Civil war continues to rage in Mexico. Out of the chaos will come a devastating attack on the US. In response, an American army would invade Mexico to hunt for the elusive Pancho Villa. Overshadowed by the First World War, it is a fascinating tale combining the drama of the Mexican Revolution with the difficulties of fighting a guerrilla force far from home in a hostile foreign country, all with a touch of the Old West as that period drew to a close. New technologies would be deployed for the first time. Future heroes of both World War I and World War II would start their rise to fame here, while another generation of Americans learned that the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans wouldn't always protect them from foreign attacks. At the centre of it all is one man. The name Pancho Villa brings up images of a romantic revolutionary, a Robin Hood figure standing up for the poor. Yet this was only part of his character. The real man was a deeply complex and often brutal figure. At one point he would seem the saviour of Mexico and of the revolution. At another, a warlord prolonging the violence and pain that rocked the nation, all in the name of personal power. For Americans at the time, he would arguably become an Osama bin Laden-style figure who must be caught or killed at all costs. Let us learn more about the man who would become Pancho Villa. Like so many other prominent leaders in history, Doroteo Arango Arambula was born in obscurity, the son of a poor sharecropper in San Juan del Rio in the state of Durango, Mexico. While working away from home, an event occurred that would change his life forever. He found out that a powerful landowner had raped his sister after she had spurned his advances. Villa returned home and killed the landowner to avenge his sister, before stealing his horse and fleeing into the Sierra Madre mountains. With the sun setting behind him, he chose to live the life of a bandit. Already his story was taking on a cinematic quality. Captured by the state, he narrowly avoided the hangman's noose and was forced into the army. Within a year, he had killed his officer, stolen his horse, and gone back to banditry. Definitely seeing a pattern here. Now he adopted the alias Francisco Villa and soon earned the nickname Pancho. Pancho Villa had now been born. So he might have stayed, a small-time bandit, but fate intervened. In 1910, Mexico collapsed into revolution, and a series of brutal civil wars began. As they say in Game of Thrones, chaos is a ladder. It certainly would be for Pancho. In return for promises of amnesty and a seemingly genuine respect for Madero, he joined the rebel forces, fighting against the Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz. Around this time, an American reporter described him as stockily built and of medium height, with the chest and shoulders of a prize fighter, and the most perfect bullet-shaped head I'd ever seen. A small black moustache serves to mask a mouth which is cruel even when smiling. Brown eyes that were not really eyes at all, but gimlets which seemed to bore into your very soul. A rampant womanizer, he married multiple times without bothering to divorce his previous wives, and was apparently so well endowed he was given the nickname the Centaur of the North. At the start of the revolution, he had a force of just 14 men. By the time Diaz fled, he led an army of tens of thousands, and was one of the leading rebel generals. Despite the triumph of the rebels, Pancho feared Madero was making a big mistake giving so much power to former Diaz supporters. He publicly rebuked his hero. "You, sir, have destroyed the revolution. It's simple. This bunch of dandies have made a fool of you, and this will eventually cost us our necks, yours included." Villa had better instincts than his former hero. Behind the scenes, former Diaz supporter General Herta, the jackal we met in the last episode, was already plotting to seize power. First, however, he was determined to remove Pancho, who he feared and envied. He cunningly provoked an argument with Villa and insulted him as a mere peasant bandit. When Pancho struck him, Herta had him arrested and sentenced to death by firing squad. You are an observer at Pancho Villa's execution. A deadly calm settles on the parade ground as Villa is dragged out. He has been beaten, his face bloody, and he has a black eye. On instinct, you look at General Herta. A satisfied smile has lit up his face. It appears the general has taken his revenge for Villa striking him. What a downfall, you think, from hero of the revolution to prisoner, to death at the hands of an army he helped lead. Villa is not afraid, however. He stands defiantly, glaring at Herta until his eyes are blindfolded. The officer reads out the charges. "Pancho Villa, you are guilty of striking a superior officer. You are now an enemy of the revolution and all Mexico. The sentence is death." The firing squad lift their rifles. It will all be over soon. Suddenly a voice shouts, "Wait! Wait! Don't shoot!" You see an out-of-breath officer frantically running towards you. "New orders from Mexico City! His life is to be spared!" Villa laughs as they take off his blindfold and escort him back to jail. You are amazed at his luck. You catch sight once more of Herta's face. It looks practically demonic with rage. Villa's life was saved by powerful patrons speaking on his behalf. After 7 months in prison, Villa managed to escape by soaring through the bars of his cell, courtesy of a sympathetic court clerk. Ironically, considering the future, he fled to the United States. When Herta launched his coup and murdered Madero, Villa joined the new rebel forces who wanted to overthrow his regime. While technically he served under Venustiano Carranza, the leader of the constitutionalist forces, it was actually a marriage of convenience. Neither liked the other. Villa mocked Carranza as a dandy and one who used to sleep on pillows. Carranza in turn regarded Pancho as an uneducated barbarian. This would be really important for the future. Still, for now, they were allies. This was the period of Villa's life that truly made him a legend of Mexico and the Revolution. He organized a formidable new army, the División del Norte, Division of the North, built around the ultra-brave, ultra-loyal Dorados, men of gold, his version of Napoleon's old guard, all funded by a unique mixture of taxing the rich and train robberies. With the fall of Herta, Villa's popularity and power were at their height. It would all be downhill from now on. Falling out with Carranza, their quarrel soon turned into a third civil war. Pancho remained a great leader with the strongest forces in Mexico. However, he was about to get a nasty shock. Carranza hired German advisors from the Western Front. Like many a World War I general, Villa sent his army to its death in futile charges against barbed wire, machine guns and trenches. Soon, he had only 400 loyal followers left and was on the run. He seemed unable to adapt as the mechanized warfare of the Western Front came to Mexico. Up until now, most Americans viewed Villa as a romantic hero. The journalist John Reed dubbed him the Mexican Robin Hood, and Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan described him as Sir Galahad. President Wilson even described Villa as a sort of Robin Hood who had spent an eventful life, robbing the rich in order to give to the poor. He even at some point kept a butcher's shop for the purpose of distributing to the poor the proceeds of his innumerable cattle raids. Hollywood even glamorized him in a movie filmed on location with Villa's cooperation. It must always be remembered that one of Pancho's greatest skills was self-promotion. In return, Villa had been the most pro-American among the revolutionaries. Even the occupation of Veracruz didn't faze him, claiming to his followers that it is Herta's bull that is being gored. What changed? Why did this mutual admiration society end? 2 words: Wilson and politics. Firstly, Wilson cut off the supply of weapons to Villa and recognized the Carranza government. With war raging in Europe, he wanted stability along America's southern border. Secondly, Pancho desperately needed something to happen to bolster his flagging cause. He knew that anti-Americanism was at record highs in Mexico due to the invasion of Veracruz. If he attacked the US and they invaded Mexico, he would once again be the nationalist hero he wanted to be. And Carranza would be in a world of trouble. The whole game board of Mexican politics would be reset at one stroke. He started off slow. On January the 10th, 1916, a band of Villistas stopped a train near the town of Santa Isabel in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. Yes, that's where the name for the dog comes from. They robbed all the passengers, but did not harm the Mexicans. but the 17 American mining engineers aboard the train were singled out and executed. This wasn't enough to cause a crisis, however. Pancho needed something bigger. The decision to attack the town of Columbus in New Mexico was made. It fulfilled multiple needs. It had a nearby military base, Camp Furlong, filled with valuable supplies, and the local hotel owner had cheated him in a weapons deal. Described as a, quote, sun-baked little desert town, a cluster of adobe houses, a hotel, a few stores, and streets knee-deep in sand. All around was the vast desert with its cactus, mesquite, and rattlesnakes, end quote. This unremarkable desert town was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. At 4:30 a.m. on March the 9th, 600 of Villa's men attacked Columbus and Camp Furlong. The raiders cut a swathe of destruction through the Columbus business district. Some of them ran into the commercial hotel, the only one in town, where they grabbed what loot they could and shot 5 guests. They set fire to the grocery store across the street, and the flames quickly engulfed the hotel as well. The Mexicans also fired into private homes, killing and wounding more residents of Columbus. For the townsfolk, it became a desperate battle for survival. Lieutenant William A. McCain, his wife and little girl, hid in the mesquite behind his house when the gunshots started. The sounds of battle seemed to be dying down when an isolated Mexican stumbled upon this little clump of Americans. Before he could do anything, McCain shot him with a shotgun, but the birdshot didn't kill him. The men grabbed the wounded Mexican and realized he had to be silenced before he could give the alarm. They tried to cut his throat with a pocket knife, but it proved too dull. They finally killed him by hammering his head with a pistol, as a distraught Mrs. McCain and her young daughter watched in horror from only a few feet away. The attack on Camp Furlong didn't go according to plan, however, particularly when they tried to enter the kitchen shack, as we shall see. It is still pitch black outside as you start preparing coffee and cooking breakfast for the hungry men of Camp Furlong. The work of an army cook is never done. You can hear gunfire in the distance, but assume it's just someone hunting. Suddenly, the door of the kitchen shack bursts open, and 2 men rush inside, shouting, "Viva Villa!" One of them fires, and a cook clutches his stomach and falls to the floor. Acting solely on instinct, you throw a pot of boiling hot coffee straight into the Mexican's face. As he screams in agony, his comrade points his gun at you, only to yell out in turn as an axe hits him from behind. Your fellow mess cook, Joe, has joined the fray. The Mexican with the burnt face tries to rise and aim his rifle, but you have grabbed a shotgun used for hunting and finish him off. The camp is alerted and has become a battleground. You vow that these invaders are going to regret ever attacking a US Army mess cook. Facing stiff resistance at Camp Furlong, the Villarists were driven off. When the troopers entered Columbus, they found that the burning hotel illuminated the silhouettes of the Mexican attackers. Their rifle and machine gun fire began to take a deadly toll. 3 hours after the attack, Villarists were forced to flee towards the border, relentlessly pursued by US cavalry. For Pancho, it had been something of a military disaster. He lost 100 men killed and 30 captured, at least 1/3 of his entire command. 20 Americans were dead, 6 wounded. Yet this had never been about a military victory. Politically, it achieved everything he could have hoped for, and more. The Columbus raid would have a similar impact to 9/11, the first invasion of American soil since the War of 1812. An outraged American public bayed for blood and vengeance. Wilson was reluctant to send troops into Mexico again after the Vera Cruz debacle. However, self-interest soon changed his mind. 1916 was a presidential election year, after all. Historians often assume Wilson was inevitably going to be re-elected in 1916. However, in reality it was pretty close. He won mainly due to votes from the western states. All this meant they couldn't afford not to respond to the Columbus raid. Wilson announced an army expedition will be set up once in pursuit of Villa, with the single objective of capturing him and putting a stop to his forays. This statement would come back to bite Wilson in the arse. The actual orders for the US military were to destroy Villa's army so it would no longer be a threat to the states. But now the public would judge its success solely by whether Pancho himself was captured or killed. The Hearst press, still promoting the annexation of Mexico, leapt on this with headlines such as, "Get Villa, alive or dead." The leader of the Mexican expedition would be General John Blackjack Pershing. I have to admit, when I first heard his nickname, being naive, I assumed it had something to do with cards. Actually, it was because he commanded black troops, and originally, it was a far more offensive word than black. It was actually cleaned up after he became famous. Having learned the background to it, I think we won't be using his nickname anymore in this podcast. He'd seen service in Cuba and the Philippines before suffering a horrible tragedy when most of his family were killed in a fire. Arguably, he was one of the best American officers of his time, famously described as cool as a bowl of cracked ice. He would need all his military and diplomatic skills for the upcoming expedition. The American army was not the gigantic Leviathan we know today. It was a pretty small force, mainly used to fighting Native Americans and drinking whiskey in remote western forts. To bulk up Pershing's force, the National Guard was to be called up. This raised some issues, however, as we saw in the episodes on the Spanish-American War. The National Guard was pretty terrible at this time. Training was often substandard, and most states didn't have entry standards or even basic requirements. When the balloon went up, the army was in for a nasty surprise. Many of the recruits were not fit for service. The reasons were varied, including venereal disease, bad vision verging on blindness, hernias, bad teeth, obesity, overall poor physique, underweight or overweight, amputations, and extreme deformities. Had to admit, I'm really curious what the extreme deformities were. Also, as per the Spanish-American War, the training camps didn't have enough guns, boots, food, or even basic uniforms for the recruits. Many of them were reduced to training with sticks rather than guns. That old friend of US trainees, rampant disease, also soon made an appearance. Even geography was working against the Americans. Pershing initially had only 4,800 men. His force would eventually rise to over 12,000 by the end, to search the whole state of Chihuahua. 94,000 square miles of rough, arid land that Villa knew intimately. The Americans, by contrast, did not even have adequate maps. They would get little help from the Mexican authorities. Carranza, cursing the name Pancho Villa, had given reluctant permission for a US army to enter Mexican territory, with the understanding that Mexican forces could cross into America to hunt bandits. Wilson was happy to agree to this, with the understanding the Mexicans would never dare to try. But Carranza would hinder the expedition at every turn, even banning the Americans from using the railway system. It was tough going for the Americans. The days in the desert were boiling, the nights freezing. The War Department had not equipped the men properly. Nobody seemed to have realized that they would need warm coats in this tropical climate. It had not rained for 9 months, so dust was everywhere, often kicked up by sandstorms. A sergeant wrote that, Dust hung over the road like a curtain. The alkali got in our eyes and down our throats. It shifted into our shoes and through our clothing. Despite all of this, the expedition started off on a high. The Villarists were taken by surprise at the small town of Guerrero. 56 were killed, including one of Villa's top generals, and 35 wounded. Only 5 Americans were wounded, none killed. Yet this victory would soon be seen as a defeat. Pancho had almost certainly been there just moments before, having a leg wound seemed to. The expedition could have ended in triumph after 1 week. Instead, the Americans would never get so close to him again. Villa lay up for 2 months thereafter, hiding in a well-concealed cave high up in the Sierra Madre mountains, waiting for his leg to heal. It was during this period of his life that an interesting incident happened that he would hereafter always boast about. The dust from the arid desert irritates your eyes as you curse the bad luck that led you to this god-forsaken country. You are a US trooper riding through the Sierra Madres as part of the search for Pancho Villa. You would have more luck searching for a nail in a haystack. The mood of the rest of the soldiers in your unit is equally glum. Finally, your sergeant turns around and yells, "That's enough belly aching. We'll be heading back to base soon. Now, let's have a song." As It's a Long Way to Tipperary faintly echoes around the mountains, little do you know that in a nearby cave, someone is watching you. Pancho Villa, rebel, warlord, and America's most wanted man, smiles to himself as the troopers ride away into the distance. So close, yet so far. Logistics for the expedition were horrific. Denied the use of the railways, the army also didn't have enough horses to supply Pershing's expedition. But this was the age of the automobile, so help, of a kind at least, was at hand. Through some rather dubious appropriation of funds, the War Department went on a car-buying spree almost without comparison. White and Jeffrey quad trucks and all manner of cars, Dodges, Ford, Chevys, Studebakers, etc., were soon on their way to Mexico. The expeditionary force soon resembled an old-fashioned car enthusiast's wet dream. However, the car was still in its infancy. Most of the vehicles struggled with the rough terrain. Sometimes whole roads had to be built for them to work, while on many occasions, broken-down cars had to be pulled along by horses. The Mexican expedition was also the first time the US military used aeroplanes. There are many scholarly articles about this, reveling in their technical knowledge. However, a sad fact is that these planes were next to useless. They were one step up from the original Wright brothers plane, made from canvas and wood. Unarmed, they were meant to observe enemy movements. However, they had a nasty tendency to break down in mid-air and plunge towards the ground, often killing the poor pilots. Also, they needed completely calm air, otherwise they were highly unstable. They struggled with the winds coming down from the Sierra Madres, often having to turn around and go back to base. In just 1 month, all the aircraft were out of action. The engineers, who had been tasked with keeping them flying, were diverted to fixing all the cars that kept breaking down instead. As the expedition dragged on with no end in sight, the local population became more and more hostile. Telegraph wires were cut down when US forces passed by, and sniping became a common occurrence. Things were only going to get worse. An American cavalry unit had launched a raid deep into Mexico and needed to resupply. They'd been assured by a Mexican officer they would have a hero's welcome if they went to the small town of Parral. He was either hopeless at his job or a massive liar. As soon as they entered Parral, an angry mob formed, shouting, "Viva Villa!" and "Viva Mexico!" The local Mexican general demanded they leave immediately. As the Americans withdrew, a shot rang out and killed one of their soldiers. Suddenly, the Mexican garrison charged out and attacked them. A running gun battle between the Federales and the U.S. cavalry raged for the rest of the afternoon, leaving 70 Mexicans and 2 Americans dead. Taking shelter in the fortified village of Santa Cruz de Villegas, they were soon surrounded by 600 Carranzistas. The siege was only lifted when U.S. reinforcements arrived. Somewhere, Pancho was laughing at the chaos he was causing for his enemies. He had understood that once the Americans were in Mexico, increasingly the war wouldn't be Carranzistas versus Villerists. It would be all Mexicans against America. A furious Pershing wanted revenge, but was overruled by Wilson, who was desperate to avoid a full-scale war. However, Wilson also couldn't abandon the search for Villa. An election still needed to be won after all. Instead, the expedition began a slow, faltering withdrawal north. It was a case of, we're not retreating, but actually we are. Just very, very slowly. Despite this, the Americans were still inflicting blows on Villa's forces. One particularly daring episode involved the future legendary World War II general, George S. Patton. Just a 31-year-old lieutenant and West Point graduate in 1916, his unit wasn't even going to Mexico. But Patton had 2 things in his favour. He was the richest man in the army, and Pershing fancied his sister. He thought that if Patton was on his staff, then his sister would have to pay many a visit and he would get a chance to impress her. Thanks to being a Nepo baby with a comely sister, Patton was on his way to Mexico for a plum appointment to Pershing's staff. Such is how great careers are made. As the expedition searched fruitlessly for Villa, they received information that one of his most trusted commanders was in the area. General Julio Cardenas, head of Villa's personal bodyguard, the Dorados, or Golden Ones, was considered a key target and was held responsible for some of the most brutal killings at Columbus. Seeing an opportunity, Patton pleaded to be allowed to join the hunt and was given permission. While purchasing corn at the local Rubio ranch, he noticed a large number of suspicious-looking men hanging around. The whole atmosphere at the ranch felt tense. Suspecting trouble, he pretended to leave, then turned around his convoy of 3 cars and 10 soldiers, surrounding the ranch, cutting off the exits. What happened next was more like a Wild West gunfight than a military operation. As you enter the Rubio Ranch, a Mexican worker glares at you and runs towards the main building. The atmosphere is so tense you could cut it with a knife. Patton draws his pistols and tells you to be ready for anything. Suddenly, the oppressive silence is broken as 3 heavily armed Mexicans riding horses make a break for it. Following the rules of engagement, Patton yells, "Halt!" Instead, they charge towards you, guns blazing. You hit the dirt as bullets fly past you, narrowly missing your head. But Patton stands his ground. He fires 5 shots. And 2 hit home as a rider clutches his arm and falls from his horse. Your reinforcements arrive, but the Mexicans are desperate men and prepared to shoot their way out of your trap. Patton drags you up as you race for the shelter of a nearby building. You get there just in time as several bullets strike the wall behind you. A blinding hail of adobe dust rains down. The Battle of Rubio Ranch has begun. As Patton reloaded, one of the Mexicans charged him, gun blazing. Patton returned fire and hit the Villista's horse. Down went rider and steed in a tangle of man and horse. As the dust cleared, the man pulled himself up from under his horse, screamed in Spanish, and raised his gun. But he was too slow as Patton shot him to death. With one Villista down, Patton's men saw another gunman had escaped the ranch and was fleeing into the countryside. Lifting his rifle, he fired 3 shots, and the man fell from his horse dead. Only the original gunman Patton had shot in the arm was left. He seemed to be surrendering to one of the scouts, but suddenly raised his gun and fired, almost blowing the American's head off. Returning fire, the Villista fell to the floor dead. All 3 men wore U.S. Army trousers and possessed blankets stenciled 13th Cavalry. They'd certainly been part of the Columbus raid. They had little time to savour their victory. 40 armed Villistas rode up and opened fire. Outnumbered 3-1, Patton knew they had to withdraw. Tying the 3 Mexicans' bodies to the roofs of their cars, they engaged in a running firefight with the bandits, eventually outrunning them. Patton indulged in some almost British understatement in his official report, claiming, "We withdrew gracefully." Locals, seeing the dead bodies of Villa's men, shouted abuse and threw rocks at the convoy, but didn't try to stop them. They arrived back at base just as Pershing was giving a press conference, causing a sensation. With one of the Mexicans identified as the notorious Cardenas, Patton became a legend for helping to avenge Columbus. It was a welcome victory for the expedition in an otherwise demoralizing time. They were no closer to capturing Pancho, while relations with the Carranza government were at rock bottom. General Jacinto B. Trevino, commander of the Carrancista garrison at Chihuahua City, telegrammed Pershing that he had orders to prevent the American forces that are in this state from moving to the south, east, or west of the places they now occupy. Your forces will be attacked by the Mexican forces if these indications are not heeded. A testy Pershing replied, "I shall use my own judgment as to when and in what direction I shall move my forces." Another clash seemed inevitable. Somewhere, Pancho was having another laugh. Captain Charles T. Boyd was leading a reconnaissance mission when he reached the town of Carrizal. There he found 400 Mexican soldiers blocking his way. He could have gone around the town, but mainly due to his machismo and stubbornness, he insisted on marching through Carrizal. This was despite the Mexican officer declaring he would have to walk over the dead bodies of Mexican soldiers to enter the town. Boyd was said to have instructed his messenger to say, "Tell the son of a bitch that we're going through." Inevitably, disaster followed. The Americans were hit by a wall of lead. All the officers, including Captain Boyd, were quickly killed. The remaining soldiers were routed by Mexican cavalry. 12 Americans were killed that day, 10 wounded, and 24 captured. This clash almost led to a full-blown war between America and Mexico. Both sides' generals called for it, their respective publics baying for blood. That it didn't was due to 2 issues. First, Carranza knew he would lose such a war. Secondly, Wilson knew the US would probably be dragged into the First World War, even though he was campaigning on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." He couldn't afford a Mexican conflict. Instead, the expedition now entered a bizarre half-life. Ordered not to search for Villa anymore, but not withdrawn back to the United States. Instead, 10,000 American soldiers were left twiddling their thumbs at Camp Colonia Dublin in pretty horrible conditions. "The camp was most uncomfortable," complained Major Frank Tompkins, "due to the high winds, frequent dust storms, tropical heat of summer, freezing cold of winter, deep mud in the tropical downpours, and swarms of flies." The bored soldiers only had athletics, boozing, gambling, and whoring to occupy their time. Worried about venereal disease, Pershing set up a whole system to manage the whoring. The prostitutes were rounded up and put in a heavily guarded barbed wire stockade, nicknamed the Remount Station by the soldiers for obvious reasons. To enter, a soldier had to prove they had this $2 standard fee, then they were issued a condom and told they had 10 minutes to get the job done. Depending on the political bent of the historian you're reading, either the prostitutes loved this arrangement or were virtually sex slaves. I will say the barbed wire and armed guards don't look good. While the Americans were creating elaborate arrangements for prostitutes, Pancho Villa had also been busy. Once again a popular hero, his forces had swelled from 400 to over 5,000. So strong had he become that he managed to overrun the provincial capital not once, but twice. A bitter Pershing remarked that, "I can but feel the embarrassment of sitting here while Villa is cavorting about only a few miles south of our position." There was a final attempt to kill Pancho, this time involving espionage and poison. America knew that Pancho greatly admired Japan and that he often recruited Japanese Mexicans. This was because of Japan's transformation into a modern, powerful nation, something that Pancho wanted to do for Mexico. 2 Japanese Mexican agents called Dio and Sato were recruited and sent into the mountains. They made contact with Pancho Villa, who accepted them as allies with open arms. They were given a tour of his encampment, and they even accompanied his force when they overran a Carranzista garrison. They watched as Villa took prisoners and had slices of their noses and ears chopped off, with the warning that if men who had been so marked were ever found supporting Carranza again, they'd be shot on the spot. It's worth remembering that for all of Villa's romantic image, he could be incredibly brutal as well. The assassins had been given some poison tablets with no taste or smell. They poisoned Villa's coffee, but then watched as Villa, who understandably was paranoid he could be poisoned at any time, had one of his men drink half of the coffee first, and then watched for any reaction. Seeing none, Villa then drank the other half. The Japanese Mexican agents, however, knew that this poison did not set in immediately and took 3 days to cause death. Worried that Villa would not die, but remain seriously ill and they might become suspects, they fled for their lives. Actually, the poison seems to have had no effect on Villa at all. This would be the first of many American plots to kill foreign leaders by poison. They failed miserably. The expedition finally left Mexico in January 1917 without having caught their man. For most of those involved, it felt like a defeat. Pershing claimed the Americans had been outwitted and outbluffed at every turn, while Patton wrote a scathing letter to a friend, claiming, "Wilson has not got the soul of a louse, nor the mind of a worm, nor the backbone of a jellyfish." A rejuvenated Villa would remain a thorn in the side of Carranza until he was bought off with a large pension and a hacienda. Too dangerous to be left alive, he was assassinated in 1923. This was seemingly the fate of all the great Mexican revolutionary heroes. Just 3 months after returning from Mexico, Pershing would be heading to France to lead American forces in World War I. He did briefly become engaged to Patton's sister, but his time in France put the relationship under such strain that they broke up. How did Wilson handle his latest Mexican adventure? On the positive side, he ignored his generals and prevented a major war from breaking out. On the bad side, the whole expedition was really a failure. Pancho was stronger after it left than he'd been before. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, leave a review, subscribe, or tell a friend. In our next episode, we head all the way back to medieval times, where a Crusader army will settle the age-old question once and for all: is water essential to surviving desert warfare? Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.